So let's get to it, dear panelists, and until Dr. Adel will be joining us, we are joined by our terrific I-24 News senior correspondent, Bianca Zanini, taking the hot seat. So we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each. Our climate change protests taking it too far. So let's begin with you, Mr. Aaron Pereira. Your 30 seconds are on to lay out your initial stance, and we'll pick up the conversation from there. Please take the lead.
Thanks. Well, we're in the middle of a climate catastrophe. We're already seeing the effects of disastrous climate change at 1.2 degrees warming. And we know that this will just get worse. We need to look at what works. There is a large body of evidence that shows that non-violent, disruptive action can actually affect real change. And this gets things talked about in the news, of course, because the debate on climate change needs to really, really pick up speed. The debate on the climate crisis. And what doesn't work is signing petitions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We will, of course, elaborate that on that in a second. Steve Milloy, your 30 seconds are on. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, sure. There's no climate crisis. These agitators, many of whom are being funded by Vladimir Putin, are not accomplishing anything. As a matter of fact, they're hurting what they think is their own cause by vandalizing artwork and blocking streets and just making people dislike them. I've been trying to get people to realize that these people are out to destroy their standard of living. That is a hard sell because it's hard to get people to pay attention to that. But if destroying artwork is what gets people attention and gets people interested in what they're doing, that's fine.
Okay, last but not least, Bianca Zanini.
All right, so it's a good question, but the premise is wrong. If you believe the data, if you believe the scientists, we're looking at an upcoming global emergency. The past 8 years have been the warmest on record. The scientific community releases study after study proving this, detailing the increasingly dramatic consequences. Sea levels are rising. We're seeing extreme heat waves, devastating floods across the globe. So the question perhaps is, why, with all this knowledge, are governments, our leaders not taking action to make sure that protests like these, with all their complications, aren't even necessary?
And on that note, let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards. And Mr. Milloy, I do want to begin with you. No matter which side of the divide you're at, the stronger the crackdown, the stronger the protest, as in this clampdown on behalf of authorities. Will it lead to only a fiercer protest movement?
I don't know what's going to happen. I can't predict the future, but I can tell you that these movements are accomplishing nothing. There's no climate crisis. We just had 8 years, 500 billion tons of emissions, and no global warming. We're told that every emission warms the planet. That is not true. These kids are misinformed. They are accomplishing nothing.
Say something to this. You're saying that there's no climate crisis, but only less than 3% of climate scientists, people who actually work in the field with this, believe that humans have little or no influence on this. And it's simply incorrect to say that there is no climate crisis when we look at the data that is being released every single month, every single week from bodies like the UN and from international bodies all across the globe. So you can't just close your eyes and say that there isn't a climate crisis when clearly the scientific data shows that there is.
I can't believe we're actually debating this in 2023. The debate is not whether a climate crisis exists. The debate is, what are we going to do about it? Right. Climate deniers don't have a place in this debate, unfortunately. The climate science is clear. It's a consensus. I'm sorry, but if we're really going to debate this on a serious news channel, I'm going to turn off my Skype right now.
Understandable, because again, we convened this summit not to discuss climate change, climate crisis or no, but rather the tactics of authorities and of protesters and how to proceed from here. And in this respect, Mr. Pereira, I want to ask you, does prosecution or intimidation of social activists is to an extent a limitation on free speech? Is it an attempt to shoot the messenger here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Obviously, we think that the right to protest should be protected as a democratic right. In the Netherlands, it's in our constitution. So this is extremely important. And we believe that the climate crisis has a democratic solution. So we have three demands. First is tell the truth about the climate and ecological crisis. You have to acknowledge that there is a crisis for this. Yeah. Second is do what is necessary to reduce emissions to net zero by 2025. This is the amount of carbon budget that we have to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming with a 66% chance. And the third is a citizens' assembly to essentially discuss within broader society how we are going to address the climate crisis, not whether. That's not the question.
And Mr. Milloy, I would like to refer the same question to you. Is the crackdown or prosecution of activists, of protesters, is a limitation of free speech?
Well, you just heard that you guys want to limit my free speech. I can't say there's no climate crisis. So there's a lot of hypocrisy going on here. Is anyone's speech being threatened by the police? No, you cannot vandalize the artwork. You cannot block people from getting to work. If they don't believe you, they don't have to follow you. Okay, they have freedom of thought as well. But of course,
the climate crisis is not a question of belief. It is a question of science.
You want to control me just like you're doing right now. You're so rude. You're so rude.
No, we encourage interaction, Mr. Milloy. Yeah, please keep on going.
I'd like to add here that although I think it's really important...
Let's just allow Mr. Milloy to conclude his sentence because we do want to hear all opinions.
This is not an opinion, sorry. It's climate crisis is about facts. We can't talk about the climate crisis if we're treating it as an opinion.
I don't.
No, we asked for Mr. Milloy's take on freedom of speech here. Yes, Bianca, please chime in.
Well, I wanted to say that although it's really important to discuss the way that these protests are held, how disruptive protests should be allowed to be, first of all, I want to remind people that out of these 1,500 arrests that happened over the weekend, only 40 are going to be prosecuted. The rest were just, the aim of the arrests was to stop the protest. And second of all, again, the protesters are not the issue they're not at the heart of the issue here, right? The lack of action that makes these protesters believe that this is the only way, that's the issue that needs to be discussed.
And yet, Mr. Pereira, following what we just heard from Bianca Zanini, recent polls suggest, at least in Germany, that some 2/3 of Germans have negative opinions of this type of tactic of protest. So my question to you is whether you have reached the point of being counterproductive. Are more radical tactics alienating the greater popular support for this cause?
That's a good question. So it's not about whether we are liked, but it's more about whether we're effective. And by, throwing a can of soup against Van Gogh, for example, you get the climate crisis in the media, you get it talked about. And not everyone is going to want to throw a can of soup. Not everyone is going to agree with you throwing a can of soup. But there are a lot of people who are very concerned that we're doing nothing, or whatever it is that's being thrown on that painting. The paintings were unharmed, by the way, of course. But of course, it's a shocking action. But really, when you look at the consequences of the climate crisis, what is happening right now is even more shocking. You have 33 million people displaced by flooding in Pakistan. You have 43,000 people killed by drought in Somalia last year. So when you compare these kind of innocent actions, let's say a painting that needs to be cleaned or whatever, flowers that get covered in dirt, with what is actually happening in the climate crisis, then the comparison is laughable.
Bianca Zanini, but we do have the point here of the legal framework, if you will. And if blocking roads is illegal, why shouldn't activists for that or this cause be held accountable? Isn't it opening a slippery slope to an extent for agenda-driven, quote-unquote, crimes?
Well, I want to say that this is not the only issue where protesters do this. I mean, we've seen weeks and months of protests here in Israel where protesters believe so much in their cause that they go out and they block streets and roads, and it causes a lot of friction, but it also causes a lot of attention, and it sends out the message. And I want to add to this that the message in and of itself is not just to create awareness. There is awareness. There can be more, but it also opens doors to the private sector. When something becomes an issue that people know about and talk about and want, suddenly there are going to be businesses that can see that not only does it make sense, it makes money as well. So of course we need the political part, but these actions help create the buzz for the private sector to enter as well.
Mr.
Can I put say something here, because this is directly relevant to our action 2 days ago. So we're protesting against subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. And when you subsidize an industry, of course, you make it more competitive. The fossil fuel industry is something that we don't need. We've seen time and time again that it actively campaigns.
Mr. Pereira, unfortunately, we need to take a short break, but when we get back, we'll, of course, continue our discussion and also hear more from Mr. Steve Milloy. A few minutes, and we're back. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Mr. Steve Milloy, Mr. Aaron Pereira, and joining us, Dr. Michael Liadel, member of scientific staff at the Israel Home Guardians. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for staying and joining us. So we're staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to our conversation, year in, year out, declarations and summits and announcements. Is anything really changing? Let's take a listen to what the president of COP26, Alok Sharma, had to say at last year's COP27. Let's take a listen.
There was a strong push from some countries, and the message that I've delivered to them, both in private but also here, is that they need to look particularly the climate vulnerables in the eye. And you heard that from the climate vulnerable countries. They acknowledged the fact that we had made historic progress on a loss and damage fund, but they were incredibly disappointed as well that we hadn't managed to make more progress on mitigation.
Okay, gentlemen, let's get to it. Another quick fire round, 30 seconds each, and we'll pick it up from there. Are global climate initiatives and summits effective at all? Mr. Steve Milloy, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Yeah, no, they're not, because emissions don't cause warming. We've had 9 years, no warming, 500 billion tons of emissions. It's not true. There's no extreme weather event that correlates with emissions or warming. What's driving recent warming is El Nino. We have an El Nino coming up. That's going to push some more warming. But it's got nothing to do with emissions, so there's nothing anybody's going to be able to do. That's why no climate initiative is going to work. 35 years into what I call climate idiocy, we're burning more fossil fuels than ever.
Okay, Dr. Michael Liadel, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to chime in, first of all, by stating that Mr. Milloy belongs to one of the tiniest minorities amongst scientists on this planet. The vast majority of scientists have solid evidence and stand behind the fact that the climate is indeed changing, and the change is, in fact, accelerating, and we're only at the very bottom of the curve of change, and much worse things are in store. That is the general consensus among scientists. It's always possible to find a naysayer like Mr. Milloy who'll get on side in order to make some noise.
Okay, Mr. Aaron Pereira, conclude this quick fire round for us.
Yeah, I fully agree with what was said before. We're talking about science here, we're not talking about fairy tales. Climate change denial is a fairy tale. So to answer the actual question, I think initiatives like the IPCC have been great in terms of international cooperation, because the climate crisis is a global problem. However, there's been too little done, of course, and there have been year after year of reports which say, we're heading towards real catastrophe and no action.
Yes, and from this point onward, gentlemen, now let's please feel free to interact. Dr. Adel, I do want to begin with you. Is climate change becoming a political sticking point, or let me rephrase, can it become apolitical?
It cannot become apolitical per se. It has to be political, because it's only when political leaders take strong stances that real change will occur. I fully stand behind what the protesters are doing. I believe that as climate change becomes more extreme, the things that protesters are willing to do will also become more extreme. And, just because one lives in an apartment block in New York City or something and is in air conditioning all day and is not exposed to the real effects of climate change, that doesn't really mean that you don't have a responsibility to act. And in fact, I stand behind the way these protests are behaving, and these protesters are behaving.
Yeah, Mr. Milloy, it will not be a first, nor will it be the last. Is this crackdown on protest merely a diversion method on behalf of governments, of authorities trying to disguise their lack of climate policy?
Well, no, we've tried everything on climate. We've tried subsidizing windmills and solar panels. It doesn't matter. The whole climate thing is a hoax. Is there a political? The whole thing is it's got a political agenda behind it. It's all about politics. It's all about controlling our standard of living. It's all about reducing our. It's about.
I don't think you can really broadcast this kind of stuff.
Yes,
this is absolute nonsense.
Mr. Pereira, please, yes.
This is really nonsense. Why are you broadcasting this?
Yeah.
Shut up, my word. The environmentalists want to kill 75% of the population, down to 2 billion.
Okay. We will go back to our original topic for this conversation. Again, not the cause, but the means. That's a different discussion that we are willing to engage in here. Dr. Adel, should or could civil uprising be civil?
Well, first of all, I think that the position that the current protesters are taking is quite reasonable. They're attempting not to break the law. They're only performing acts which have a minimal impact really on society. If we compare that to the impact of what climate change is currently doing in countries that are really already exposed to climate change, such as those in the Middle East, such as those in South Asia, and you look at the impact on populations there, it's absolutely incomparable to the minor impact that these protesters are having on day-to-day life in Western countries.
Yeah, Mr. Pereira, are we witnessing a targeted, orchestrated campaign against Extinction Rebellion? What are we seeing here exactly?
Well, I mean, I think that's a bit of a loaded question. What we're seeing actually is we are challenging the establishment, and we see, an establishment that is not so happy with that pushing back.
Yeah.
And as I said before, we're a democratic movement. We believe that through democratic means, we can go against the climate crisis. We can reduce the damage. So it's really important that we protect and safeguard the right to protest. And at the moment, what we're seeing is this is not happening.
Yeah.
There's a backlash.
But do you understand the concern, perhaps, that we're heading towards a radicalizing loop to an extent? The harsher the backlash, the harsher the counterattack, et cetera, meaning that at the end of the day, we will only see a harsher crackdown on behalf of authorities?
Well, what we've seen is that this works, actually, what we're doing. So we've been, for example, our last protest campaign, we've been coming back to the same spot outside the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate and, doing this, essentially sitting on the street. And the first time or the second time we did it, it was only a few of us. And, there was very critical response in the media, etc. But one, we stay peaceful and non-violent, and we repeat the message. And now it's being talked about in the media. It's been talked about in politics. In fact, the question of fossil subsidies for the use of fossil fuels, has been. It used to be a topic a long time ago. In 2013, it was promised that the government would get rid of these subsidies. Also in 2018, and it hasn't. So by doing these kind of protests, we're putting a spotlight on this, holding them accountable, and people are annoyed. Many people are, but it gets the topic talked about.
So
if I could add a remark on the topic of the subsidies, the country that I live in is very much the energy economy here is based on fossil fuels, based on gas that's was discovered over the last 15 or 20 years. Nonetheless, all the government has to do is basically to get out of the way. They've got to stop putting up barriers to the introduction of the alternatives, of the renewable alternatives. We have a massive opportunity to move forward with solar, but the problem is that there are many, many ways in which the bureaucracy in this country is moving much too slowly. So as far as the subsidies are concerned, that's an active barrier to the transition to clean energy. And so this is catastrophic in terms of driving the agenda of removing the barriers to climate change.
Yeah, what appears to be recurring.
We have 30 billion in subsidies every year from the Dutch government, and this essentially stifles innovation in renewable technologies. What you said.
What seems to be recurring a method, if you will, is not to talk about substance, but rather methods, and by that, again, divert the spotlight.